As was said, I'm a lecturer in philosophy at Birkbeck, and my area of specialization is the philosophy of art. And one of the main questions in the philosophy of art is the nature and value of creativity, or as I'm going to say today, imaginativeness. Now, it's something of a cliche that imaginativeness and creativity are a good thing. So childhood, for example, is romanticized as a time when we are particularly imaginative, and people in public life are often said to need imaginativeness in order to be a particularly inspiring leader. As George Bush Sr. put it, he felt that he lacked the vision thing. And this view of imaginativeness has very deep historical roots. So the Romantics, in particular, romanticized the imagination very greatly. I'll just give you a quotation here. In his old age, William Blake wrote a letter to a friend of his, and he described himself as very weak and an old man, feeble and tottering, but not in spirit and life, not in the real man, the imagination which liveth forever. So this kind of view has filtered down into our culture and has become very widespread, and as I say, to the point even of being a cliche. But I like to ask the question today, why is it that imaginativeness or creativity is valuable? Perhaps because it's so widely acknowledged to be a good thing, we rarely pause to ask the question, why is it a good thing, if it is? So that's what I'd like to say a bit about today. Now, the question of the value of imaginativeness can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and I'll get to some of those in a moment. But what I'd like to look at first is the prior question, what is imaginativeness? I'm going to present some of my views on what the nature of imaginativeness is, to begin. And on the basis of that, I'm going to provide an explanation of the value of imaginativeness. Now, imaginativeness is quite often associated with a number of other values, such as originality or freedom from rules, for instance. But I think there are really two essential features of an imaginative act or a product of an act that is imaginative. So the first feature, I think, is that an imaginative act or product can't have been an act or product that was an obvious thing to think of. So, for example, after the movie We Need to Talk About Kevin was released, there appeared a popular science book with the title We Need to Talk About Kelvin. Now, I think that's a very imaginative title for a popular science book. And I think part of the explanation of this is that that title was not an obvious title to think of. If I sat down to try and figure out a title for a popular science book, it would have taken me a very long time to come up with that, if I ever would have. So I think that is one crucial feature of imaginativeness, that the imaginative thing, whether it be an act or a product of an act, not have been an obvious thing to think of. And again, we can think of other examples of imaginative acts and products that appear to conform to this condition. So if I were to dance right now to get your attention, that would be an imaginative way of doing so. It would also not be an obvious way of doing so, as opposed to various other ways. And similarly, Ulysses, for instance, is an imaginative novel. And in many respects, at least for the time, it was written in ways that were not imaginative, that were not obvious ways of writing a novel to think of. So this is why I say that this is a necessary condition of imaginativeness, that the act or product not have been an obvious act or product to think of. Now, I must stress, though, that it would be implausible to regard this as a sufficient condition of something being imaginative. So simply doing something not obvious is not enough to make something imaginative. I'll give you an example to substantiate that. So suppose you think of a chocolate chip cookie recipe that calls for huge amounts of balsamic vinegar. Now, you have no reason in this scenario to think that that will make it any good. You just include that at random in the recipe. Now, I think it's unlikely that this will have been an imaginative recipe for you to think of. And And that is despite the fact that this was certainly not an obvious chocolate chip cookie recipe to think of. So I think it's cases like these that suggest that simply doing something not obvious is not sufficient in order to do something imaginative. Perhaps, maybe in a sarcastic sense, we might describe some of these cases as imaginative. But I think that is a derivative use of the term. What then do we need to add in order for something to count as imaginative, in addition to the non-obviousness condition that I mentioned? Well, I think one thing we need to add is this. The person who thought of the act or product must have had reasonably good grounds to think that doing the act, or making the product in the way that they did, would make it a valuable act or product. So take, for instance, Frank Gehry's design for the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. Many of you will be familiar with this. It's a very distinctive, very unusual shape. Now that building is designed in a very imaginative way. And the building has a shape that is certainly not an obvious shape to think of. But it's more than that. Unlike my example of the chocolate chip cookie recipe, that shape has many features that contribute to the building's value as a building. So for instance, the shape helps make the building dynamic, expressive, spectacular from a distance without being overwhelming from street level, and so on. So I think this is support for the claim that we need to add this other condition to our conditions of imaginativeness. It must not only be an unobvious act or product to think of, but the person who thought of it must have had reasonably good grounds, at least, for thinking that it would have value as the kind of act or product that it is. Now, it's not just acts or products that can be imaginative. Obviously, in a different sense, people can be imaginative. And I think if we have this account of the imaginativeness of acts and products in place, it's relatively easy to say what it is for a person to be imaginative. A person who is imaginative has a tendency to think of unobvious acts or products that they had good grounds for believing would be valuable as the kinds of acts or products that they were. So with this account in place, we can turn to this question of the value of imaginativeness. Now, as I said, this question can be interpreted in a variety of ways. For example, it's long been customary in philosophy to distinguish between at least two ways in which a thing can be valuable or good. So, on the one hand, many valuable things are valuable because they have valuable effects. Money would be the classic example of something that many philosophers have regarded as something valuable solely because it has valuable effects. If money had no power to produce any valuable effects, or any effects that were of value to anybody, it would not, according to this line of thinking, be valuable at all. This philosophers call instrumental value. In contrast with this, it's been traditional to distinguish things that are not only instrumentally valuable, but valuable in themselves. That is to say, things that are valuable quite apart from any valuable effects, if any, that they have. Now, it's a very venerable question in philosophy which things are valuable in themselves. But some examples that have been proposed include such things as friendship, pleasure, love, things like this. So with this distinction in place between something instrumentally valuable and something valuable in itself, we can pose the question of the value of imaginativeness in a more precise way. Is imaginativeness valuable merely for its effects, or is it something valuable in itself? And in particular, I want to consider the question, is it good for the imaginative person solely because of its effects, or because it's good in itself for that person? Now, I think it's quite obvious that on many occasions when imaginativeness is good for the imaginative person, it's good because of its effects. So quite obviously, it can be very good for a student taking an exam who's able to think of unobvious answers that have a reasonable chance of being right. That's a very useful ability or tendency for that student to have. And it may be only instrumentally valuable in that situation. It may be only valuable to that student because it has good effects, namely enabling the student to pass the exam. And you can consider other examples, so cases of businesses where innovation enables them to make more money, and so on. So I don't think there's much controversy that that is at least one reason why imaginativeness is valuable for the imaginative person, when it is valuable for the imaginative person. However, I think the more interesting question is this. Is imaginativeness ever good in itself for the imaginative person? Is it comparable to those goods in life, such as friendship or pleasure, which philosophers have often thought to be things good in themselves and partly constitutive of a good life? I want to suggest that one can make the case that that is true, that in many situations at least, imaginativeness is good in itself for the imaginative person. What I want to suggest is that this is so because of the connection between being an imaginative person and being an irreplaceable person. Now you remember what I said at the start, that according to my account, imaginativeness involves the ability or the tendency to think of unobvious ways of contributing value to something or of doing something well. Now, when it's true that you think of something unobvious, it's generally also true that few, if any, other people would have thought of that thing that you thought of if they were placed in the same situation. So take an example. Michelangelo has a depiction of God separating light from darkness on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Now this is a very difficult subject to depict, and there are very few depictions of it in prior art. And Michelangelo comes up with a very imaginative solution to it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. But the way in which he depicts this scene is a very original and imaginative one. Now what's striking about this is that on account of its being unobvious, not an obvious way of depicting God separating light from darkness to think of, very few other people, even very few other gifted artists, would have thought of just that way of depicting that scene as Michelangelo did. So even another imaginative artist would have been unlikely to hit upon just that way of depicting God separating light from darkness. Even, we can imagine Leonardo would come up, no doubt, with a very imaginative way of doing so if he were set the same task. But it's very unlikely that he would have come up with the same way of doing so as Michelangelo. If we want that particular kind of artistic goodness, we need Michelangelo's imaginativeness. It's in that sense that I want to suggest that an imaginative person can be an irreplaceable source of value, or at the very least, with cases where we're less ingenious than Michelangelo, replaceable by far fewer people than they would have been if they thought of something obvious. So, if this is right, then I think this provides a reason to believe that imaginativeness can be good in itself for the imaginative person. Because in many contexts, at least, it matters to us whether we're replaceable or not. Being irreplaceable matters to a lot of people in many contexts. So think about many degrading jobs that you may have had over the years. The knowledge that you are replaceable by any other able-bodied adult can be one of the more degrading features of this job. And similarly, saying something like, anybody could have done that, can be a very stinging criticism of one's work. So I think that this suggests that irreplaceability is something we very much value. We want to believe, we want to know, preferably, that we're an irreplaceable source of insight or of value. Now, I don't mean to suggest that it's always true that it's good for us to be irreplaceable. So if you're the only one who can perform some very unpleasant task, you may well be irreplaceable for that purpose, but that's not good for you. But I think in many cases, when we value achievement in some area, say you're a mathematician or you're passionate about mathematics, and due to your imaginativeness, you're an irreplaceable source of certain imaginative insights. That can be grounds for justified pride and self-respect, on the grounds, namely, that your imaginativeness in that regard makes you irreplaceable. So it's for that reason that I want to suggest that imaginativeness obviously is valuable because it has valuable effects in many cases, but one can also make the case that imaginativeness is good in itself for the imaginative person. Thank you very much.